You're right back there. Okay. All right. So let's go over this real quick. So the first thing you guys see on your on page one, learning target 12. Okay, you guys should see a graph there. And that graph should appear up there, and it should you should see basically how the graph is changing. Okay, and that graph, if you guys remember, we talked a lot about that graph when we talked about this unit way back when, early in October, and the topic for that was how America went from being green to gray, right? How America went from being green to gray, how we went from being an agricultural country, a rural or agrarian country, to be more of an urbanized, factory based economy. Okay. Um, so they often refer to that as an industrialized capitalism. So, what we're really looking for in that question, it says, what were the causes and effects of the patterns shown in the circle graphs above? We basically want to show how from 1860 to 1920, the causes and effects of urbanization. How do we go from being a country that was once firmly entrenched in farming and, you know, where the majority of people were living in rural settings, to where the majority of our country was living in cities um, by 1920. So let's look at the causes and effects here. So essentially, when you look at the main cause, you're looking at the attachment of how industrialization basically leads to urbanization. Remember, urbanization is the growth of cities. Industrialization, you know, is a variety of things. The rise of heavy industry, the mechanization of farming, the assembly line production, all that stuff. So the rise of factories and assembly line production is going to create jobs. Okay. So the impact of that, the effect of that, is competition for jobs. So people are going to go to the cities and search for jobs, for employment, and that obviously is going to lead to greater growth. Mechanized farming is a big impact, and this is a commonly asked question on your Ohio State test. Okay, so I would definitely make sure you guys know this and are aware of this. That, for example, we talked about this, when we have more mechanized farming, like eventually the tractor, but the McCormick harvest and reaper, better steel technology, better plows, etc. Even things early on like the seed drill, and we even talked about Eli Whitney and his inventions like the cotton gin. Even early on, that revolutionized the cotton industry. It made things more um, more efficient. You needed less hands to work. Okay, so the fewer farm hands, um, the fewer people you had to pay, and so the farm hands couldn't find work. So where do they go? They go to the cities. Okay. As cities expand, though, you get overpopulation, you get a rise in crime, emergence of some gangs, you get violence. But cities began to expand as well. And then with the expansion, you saw a rise in transportation, improvements in transportation, subways, cars, roads, trolleys, the elevated trains in Chicago, for example, the expansion of the cities. Immigration, we talked about immigration, old and new immigration. Um, was another cause, and the effect of urbanization is going to lead to crowded living conditions. But we talk about old immigration, Northern and Western Europeans, essentially um, from Great Britain, Ireland, Western Europe, and then from Northern Europe, mostly Germany. Think about Cincinnati, for example. The predominant number of German and Irish Americans there, and then the new immigration, from 1880s on, we saw a lot of Southern and Eastern Europeans migrating, the Italian, the Greeks, then Eastern European, Baltic, Slavic nations as well, Polish, Russian, um, also rolling into America as well during that time period before the 1920s quotas started pouring in. And then also the Great Migration. which some historians will tell you began. And there's a debate like when they technically began, but a lot of people say it began late 1800s. But the big wave was actually early on in the 1900s during World War One to fill the big void in factory jobs left by Americans who were drafted into World War One. So you could argue industrialization did create that as well. But the Great Migration of African Americans, which led to again crowded living conditions and also de facto segregation in those cities. But the crowded living conditions, we also saw the rise of tenement buildings, uh, shabbily built buildings, and in horrible living conditions as well, overcrowded, poorly ventilated, horribly built with no building codes in big cities. Often were victimized by fires, buildings collapsing. Not to mention they are susceptible to the spread of disease and illness due to poor ventilation. I mean, lack of windows, lack of sanitation. Very literally, you get the expression there was only a pot to pee in. That was pretty much it. People disposed of their human waste by just simply dumping it out in the alleyways outside of a window. In some cases, if there was a nicer tenement, there might be one bathroom to share per hallway, but very quickly and hastily built just to accommodate the growing populations in major cities. So that's the cause and effects of urbanization. So understand that those conditions, and there's going to be ramifications for that. So let's turn the page here to Learning Target 13. So when we talk about Learning Target 13, that's describe institutionalized racist practices in the South. And this is something you guys, we've been talking about a lot. Um, in my opinion, we go over stuff right here. Sorry, I'm trying to make an underline here. Got to do a better job of that. Good Lord, Mr. Marks. Okay, well, I'll have to do. All right. So the key thing in talking about institutionalized racism is after the removal of federal troops after Reconstruction in 1877. So we talked about in 1876 the corrupt bargain or the compromise of 1877 during the election there with Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden. Rutherford B. Hayes was elected um, after the normal election period. Then there wasn't enough electoral votes. The compromise was that the Republicans would win the election. But the compromise was with the Democrats was that there would be the removal of federal troops from the South. And once federal troops were removed from the South, and so was the Freedmen's Bureau, it became open season on the African Americans. So what the southern states began to do at that point, that juncture, was try to undermine the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the 13th Amendment was ending slavery. The 14th Amendment was equal protection and due process for all Americans. And the 15th Amendment was protection of the right to vote. So the southern states began to try to undermine those through segregation laws designed to keep African Americans disenfranchised and to keep them under their foot. So what you guys need to do really quick, if you guys can look at that section, there's a 4-piece diagram there. Look for 4 examples in your reading, okay? Or 4 examples you might even know off the top of your head of either Jim Crow laws that would disenfranchise. Disenfranchise means keep people from voting or participating in government. Okay. Key Supreme Court cases or court cases. Okay. Or any other examples of segregation laws that were passed known as Jim Crow laws. Okay, I'll give you guys a minute to do that. Yeah, what was that again? I'm sorry. Yeah, literacy tests. Okay, that's an example of disenfranchisement, right? What are some other examples of disenfranchisement besides literacy tests? Ways that they would keep African Americans from participating in the voting experience. Poll taxes. What else? One more big one. Yeah, Brandon. Okay, that's a good. Okay, hold off on that for a second. Hold off on that for a second. What's another way to keep people from voting if your blank was a slave? Grandfather clauses. If your grandfather was a slave, you couldn't vote. How stupid was that, right? Okay, then Brandon, what'd you say? Plessy versus Ferguson was probably one of the most significant examples of institutionalized racism because that basically legalized Jim Crow. Yeah, plain and simple. And then what? Somebody else said something after that. Did you say something else, Doctor Dimes? Yeah, I think the KKK is a good example of intimidation. They also did a good job of disenfranchising, preventing African Americans from registering to vote, for voting. What else? What other examples of segregation or Jim Crow? What was segregated in the South that was really significant? Yep. Just give me an example of something else that was segregated. Think Rosa Parks. Yes, thank you. Now you can go, Zach. What's that? Yes. Talk like the lunch counters and stuff. Okay. Yep. Yeah, bathroom. I'll put a center after that. It's good. Yeah, bathrooms, everything. Okay, good. We also mentioned marriage laws, right? Like interracial marriage. Also another example. Right? Those are things like that. Okay, good. Until 1954, that's when things started changing with Brown v. Board of Education was passed. That's when we went after schools and the desegregation began starting there. And then Rosa Parks stood up against buses. You start seeing the steps there. All right. Last thing, let's take a look. The last thing here is the political cartoon. And when we look at that political cartoon, you see the giant oil oil well and the oil not the can but the oil reserve, sorry, from Standard Oil. And when we look over that, we talked a lot about the problems of the industrial age. And one of the big problems of the industrial age, and I know this is a lot, guys. You want to turn over to the back of your paper there, the very last page, all the way to the back of your whole packet. And I would write this on the back. I would put this table on the back. Okay, this is a big one, and I'll leave this up here for you. Okay. So this is probably, in my opinion, one of the most significant things we talked about all year. We talked about the progressive era, and where this political cartoon addresses the very first one. We talk about the problems of monopolies and trusts. Okay. The issues of monopolies and trusts. Probably the biggest issue we talked about was the dangers of creating, you know, control over an entire industry by one business or one entity. And that's what a trust does. When that happens, they can dictate prices. They eliminate competition. When you eliminate competition, that's bad for you, the consumer. Okay, we love competition in our economy. We want competition. All right, we love the idea of that. That's at the heart of free enterprise. Um, and sometimes unethical business practices can take place, and that's the danger with Standard Oil. That's the problem with Standard Oil. Mr. Mark speaking. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Where's that at? Okay. All right. Can I go to 4:15 after this class? Okay, to finish your test. All right. So one of the great muckrakers. Do you remember what a muckraker is? A muckraker is someone who exposes the ills of society. It could be a journalist, it could be a political cartoonist, it could be a novelist, a photojournalist. We talk to these people. It could be like an investigative journalist today. It's someone who exposes the problems, the ills of society. And Ida Tarbell was an interesting figure. We mentioned her. Remember, her father's business was ruined as his little town was destroyed when John D. Rockefeller ruined the oil refinery in the town that they lived in, and she kind of vowed to get her revenge. And she wrote a scathing expose in McClure magazine called "The History of Standard Oil." It was a 17 part expose, and she just cut into John D. Rockefeller, and her investigative journalistic work exposed every little seething detail about his life and about his corrupt practices. And people were outraged. And what did that lead to? It led to the Sherman Antitrust Act. It led to them breaking up Standard Oil. Okay. And other big companies were broken up using the Sherman Antitrust Act, like Northern Securities. And after 1914, we improved some of the loopholes in the Sherman Antitrust Act, and they had the Clayton Antitrust Act. Because the Sherman Antitrust Act is actually used in a lot of cases to expose and break up labor unions, unfortunately. And the most famous person who broke up a lot of trust and monopolies was Teddy Roosevelt. Remember who you get a call? Trust Busters, right? See what I did there? I used Ghostbusters and just switched the first. Okay. All right. Then we also talked about the dangers of other industries, like, for example, the meat packing or canned food industries. We read passages from Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. And although it was a novel, it was based on actual real life research. Upton Sinclair lived in Packingtown in Chicago and worked among the immigrants there in the meatpacking industry. And his novel grossed out people all over America, so much so that it led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, the FDA, the Food and Drug Agencies. Okay, there's a reason why you have labels on all your food and canned foods and stuff to this day. The Meat Inspection Act, making sure you're not eating rancid food, rancid meat. And it was also a precursor to some of our OSHA laws, our safety and health laws that we have in buildings and industry today. The third big thing in this time period, too, tied into industry, had to do with corruption as well, and the corruption in political um, in politics, I'm sorry, but in the political machines, as we called them. The one case study we looked at was the political machine in New York City, led by William Boss Tweed, and how Boss Tweed used his influence over his constituents at Tammany Hall in New York City, and how he dominated politics that time period through graft, through bribes, manipulating the accounting of the time period. Like, for example, charging $250,000 to a uh, handyman to work on, um, you know, doorknobs and accessories and faucets and bathrooms, basically using the money for bribes and for lining the pockets of other politicians and for people to get things done in the city. Basically stealing from the tax money of the people of New York to maintain power. So, because of that, and the work of cartoonist Thomas Nast, as well as many other journalists during that time period too, um, Lincoln Stevens also wrote *The Shame of the Cities*. He was also quite relevant in that time period as well. We had recall, being able to recall certain political officials at the state and local levels. A secret ballot, the Australian secret ballot to this day. We have primary elections because political machines were able to manipulate state legislatures. Referendums, the yes no vote. Initiatives, people could actually introduce legislation. We have the 19th Amendment empowering a whole nother sector of America to be able to vote. The other big one was the 17th Amendment. That's the direct election of senators. Because prior to that, senators were chosen by the state legislatures, and a lot of state legislatures were corrupted by political machines as well. The state legislatures chose senators, and state legislatures were chosen, in some cases, by corrupt political officials. And the last big issue of the Gilded Age was the poverty and the poor economic conditions. And one of the most famous muckrakers was Jacob Riis, whose book "How the Other Half Lived," or "How the Other Half Lives," exposed the conditions in tenement housing in the cities. Um, and because of his work, he did a lot of work with photojournalism and drawing and sketches. We had building codes passed. We had tenement housing laws. We had sanitation laws. And with the poor economy and the failure of some businesses and banks, we saw the Federal Reserve rise up. The Bankers Bank is a major progressive reform. And don't forget also Teddy Roosevelt. We mentioned this a little bit with the EPA and the Environmental Protection Agency in our first review on Friday. Teddy Roosevelt's work in conservation with the Newlands Act and the Antiquities Act, as well as the Bureau of Fisheries, the National Forest Act, as well, and the 230 million acres of land he set aside in conservation. Okay? All right. Let's take a look really quick at the last few pages here, the set of questions. Okay? All right. Number one. It says in the late 1800s and early 1900s, many changes occurred in the U.S. agriculture as a result of industrialization, which is one way industrialization affected agriculture. What do you guys think? So is it A, did it delay transportation? I don't think it would have delayed it, right? We saw industrialization means like better roads and railroads. That wouldn't delay, that would quicken it, right? Did it decrease opportunity to grow crops? No, if you got seed drills and better equipment, it's gonna actually improve it, right? Did it reduce the amount of labor needed to grow crops? That is correct. So the answer for number one should be C. That's the big thing there. Okay. Number two. So this is a big question. I think this is really important if we look at this one. So think of identify two working conditions that labor unions opposed. So what are some things that labor unions opposed? All right, obviously the low pay. We know the big we know the big things that low pay, long hours, dangerous conditions, right? But what about some other specific things? Child labor, bingo, good one. Do they like immigrant labor? Yeah, they wanted, they also call it scab labor because they would work for low pay, right? Anything else they opposed? Okay. What were some labor demands? Obviously, give me some specifics. So, even though there was low pay, what were some things they wanted? What were some terms they wanted? What do we have today that deals with the low pay? Very good, Kurt. Minimum wage laws. What else? Oh, long hours. How long do they want their workday to be? The 8-hour workday. Okay. We obviously know safer working conditions, end to child labor. Wanted anti-immigration laws, didn't they? I mean, didn't a lot of labor unions support anti-immigration laws? The one big thing they wanted to was collective bargaining. It means that the unions could negotiate for all the workers. They could have a set contract in place. Okay. All right, really quick. Let's look at question 6 because I know we're running out of time here. We kind of identified number 5. Look at question 6. During the 1800s, the U.S. government forced American Indians to live on reservations. Identify two specific ways that this discrimination affected American Indians. So we talked about the mistreatment of Native Americans during the time period. Um, Remember, there's two things we addressed. We talked about the Dawes Severalty Act, where natives were forced to assimilate, either basically become U.S. citizens and move off reservation and get land. Okay. Where else were some of their children sent to? What are those things called? Yep. Best example was Carlisle, where they faced a ton of mistreatment and poor treatment there. Um, they were basically like deprogrammed. Like if they were even found with materials and speaking their language, any clothing, relics, they were beaten, like medievally beaten. Some kids died there too. There was graveyards. I mean, it was ridiculous. Some of the stories of torture, especially in behalf of some like the nuns and the caretakers there, is awful. It wasn't just even the United States; it was in Canada too. It was bad. Okay, and then many other Indians were like live on life in the reservations. Yeah. All right. Make sure you guys finish up the rest of those. You should be good.